Mabuhay. Welcome to Lagim, a Filipino true crime podcast. My name is Christine, and this is episode 10 on the Maguindanao Massacre. Just before I start today's episode, I want to remind you that if you like to keep up to date with everything that has to do with this podcast, or maybe you want some additional true crime content, then do follow Lagim on social media. We are on Instagram at Lagim Podcast, on Twitter at Lagim Pod, on TikTok at Lagim Podcast, and on Facebook. Just search for Lagim, a Filipino true crime podcast. You will see that we have a fan page and also a discussion group. Lagim is also officially on YouTube now, so you can stream all the past episodes and this one right now on YouTube. Just search for Lagim Podcast on YouTube. And now to our story. Content warning. This episode contains details of violence, murder, and assault, so please make sure that you take care of yourself whilst listening. It is a bitter and hard pill to swallow when the media reveals time and time again that in recent times, the Philippines has become one of the most dangerous places in the world for journalists. A Stacker article from 2019 ranked the Philippines as number 10 out of the 15 most dangerous countries in the world for journalists, in league with countries such as Yemen, Libya, and Afghanistan. What brought this problem even more to the forefront were the murders of 34 journalists in Maguindanao to the south of the Philippines, a crime that would be woefully known as the Ampatuan Massacre. But I do not want to give more credence or recognition to the Ampatuans, so I will refer to the crime as the Maguindanao Massacre instead. However, the bit about the journalists is just one of many problematic aspects and dimensions that this case has managed to expose about Filipino politics, legal processes, and Malacanang's relationship with Mindanao. In order to fully understand why this crime happened the way it happened, we need to have, at the very least, a basic understanding of the political landscape of Maguindanao in relation to the Ampatuan clan. It is so easy for northerners, Filipinos from Central Philippines, and even other parts of Mindanao to gloss over the politics and categorize the Maguindanao Massacre as a messy, mafia-like hit. There is much history behind it, and this has to be understood in order to appreciate the gravity of the crime. The story that culminates in what now is called the Maguindanao Massacre truly started in the 1980s at the tail end of the EDSA revolution, and when then President Corazon Aquino took her position as the first female president at Malacanang Palace. But the question is, who are the Ampatuans? Let us start with the most well-known senior member of the Ampatuan clan, Andal Ampatuan Sr. In 1986, he was appointed as Chief of Offices of Maganoy, a town now called Sharif Aguac in Maguindanao. Aquino replaced every local elected official with officers in charge at the time, but the situation in Maganoy was an exception. The aging mayor Pinagayaw Ampatuan was merely replaced by the vice mayor Andal Sr., also an Ampatuan. Instead of handing over the office to someone completely new, President Aquino dealt with things differently when it came to Maganoy and when dealing with the Ampatuans. She decided to hand over this local government seat to another Ampatuan instead. 2 years later, Andal Sr. ran for mayor and won. He would proceed to serve for another 10 years. Eventually, he would run for and become governor of Maguindanao in 1998, thereby cementing the Ampatuan's hold over this part of Maguindanao for years to come. Now, as you remember from your grade school history class, Maguindanao is one of 5 predominantly Muslim provinces in the Philippines in what was formerly known as the Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao. The other provinces are Basilan, Lanao del Sur, Sulu, and Tawi-Tawi. The autonomous region in Muslim Mindanao, or ARMM or ARM, is now formally known as the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao and includes the city of Marawi as well as the other provinces already mentioned. In a nutshell, the existence of this autonomous region came about because of the history of Mindanao relative to the colonization of the Philippines by Spain. For most of Philippine history, most parts of Mindanao had been a separate territory with its own identity and culture, mostly influenced by Islam. Muslim missionaries have been known to visit the islands after all since the 14th century. During the Spanish colonization, most of Mindanao managed to resist the hostile takeover. It was not until the 19th century that the Sultanate of Sulu, who ruled over most of Mindanao, finally recognized Spain's sovereignty. But even then, the Spanish only managed to loosely control Mindanao. Even when the Japanese and Americans overrun the island afterwards, the Moros of Mindanao managed to resist and preserve their influence over the island for most of the time. During the Japanese occupation, it was the Moros and the local guerrilla units in Mindanao who helped American soldiers oust the Japanese occupiers from Mindanao during the Second World War. So, given this history of dominance over Mindanao, it is not hard to understand why in later decades the descendants of the Moros, the Muslims in Mindanao, did not feel like they truly belonged to this sovereign nation that is the Philippines, and also that they should not be ruled by some non-Muslim sitting far away in Malacanang in Manila who may not know or value the history of the Moros within Mindanao. In the early 1970s, then President Ferdinand Marcos issued a proclamation to declare an autonomous region in Mindanao, but this was unfortunately turned down by the plebiscite. Finally, in 1979, the legislature passed a law that created a regional autonomous government in western and central Mindanao. This was indeed the precursor to the ARMM that was created later in 1989. The ARMM had devolved legislative and executive powers, and so does the current Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao, or BARM. The legislature, for example, has powers in all matters, except for a few things that are left to the national government. These are things like foreign affairs, fiscal matters, administration of justice, quarantine, general auditing, national elections, trade names, copyrights, immigration, and deportation. But the legislature may still legislate on all matters covered by Sharia, the law governing Muslims. In relation to the Filipino national government, the Bangsamoro Organic Law provides that the BARMM shall remain an integral and inseparable part of the national territory of the Philippines. The President of the Philippines exercises general supervision over the regional chief minister within BARMM. The regional government has the power to create its own sources of revenues and to levy taxes, fees, and charges subject to constitutional provisions and other national laws. So, I think part of how the Ampatuans rose to power is owed to the geopolitical situation of Maguindanao. It is part of an autonomous government within the Philippines, and yet it is so far away from the capital in a country that is essentially a group of islands. It may feel like you can get away with a lot, knowing that oversight is not great to begin with. From the 1980s, let us fast forward to the Makapagal Arroyo administration, which lasted for 9 years, from 2001 to 2010. President Arroyo was a member of the Lakas Kampi CMD party, and during her term, she listed Andal Ampatuan Sr. as her ally in Maguindanao. Her party's chairman in the autonomous region was another Ampatuan, Zaldi Ampatuan to be exact, who was at that point provincial governor of ARMM. He had been elected 3 times unopposed. I am merely setting the scene here in order for you to understand that by the time Arroyo became president, it would have not been wise for her to choose anyone else as her ally in Maguindanao. Apart from Andal and Zaldi Ampatuan being allies and in leading political positions, 18 mayors within Maguindanao belonged to the Ampatuan clan. Arroyo's choice of ally paid off in the 2004 elections when she won 69% of the Maguindanaoan vote. 3 years later, the party-backed coalition scored a 12-0 sweep in the senatorial elections within the Maguindanao province. Furthermore, Arroyo supplied the ruling Ampatuan clan with a private militia of around 5,000 men to suppress any Muslim separatist rebels who could destabilize the region and therefore also the Arroyo government. Essentially, I think, Arroyo made a deal with the devil and ignored the many reports of violence against the clan in Maguindanao. She was, after all, indebted to them for giving her a clear win in Maguindanao and for doing her bidding within the region. However, the tensions could no longer be suppressed and ignored, especially those arising between the Ampatuans and their rival clan, the Mangudadatus. Oddly enough, they were of the same political party. So, Arroyo sought to mediate between the two clans to prevent any election-related violence in the lead-up to the 2010 national elections. Mediation efforts took place in mid-2009, with a meeting hosted by the then-party chairman Gilberto Teodoro. It was later disclosed that in the meeting there was an initial agreement in principle that said that no Mangudadatu would contest Ampatuan Sr.'s gubernatorial post. Now, I could not find in my research if this agreement in principle indeed was true. Assuming it is, and needless to say, the Mangudadatus did not hold their end of the agreement because Esmail Mangudadatu had planned to file his candidacy for the gubernatorial post that very year. And this brings us to November 2009. Around the 19th of November 2009, it can be assumed that Esmail's plans about running for governor have become more known in the wider community that even he himself noticed how there were major troop movements amongst Ampatuan-led security forces around that time. Around this time as well, a witness who was in the police force allegedly received a call from Andal Ampatuan Jr.'s brother called Banarin Ampatuan. He was ordering him to deploy a police auxiliary force in Saniag in the town of Ampatuan, which is just 2 minutes away from Sitio Malating, a location that has relevance to this story, so make sure to remember that name. The police auxiliary force was said to be heavily armed with heavy-powered firearms, which included M14s, M16s, and one Garand, a semi-automatic rifle. The police troops at Malating were told to man the checkpoint to check if any Mangudadatus would be passing through. A local resident had witnessed how around 100 militiamen and police were gathered near the checkpoint a few days before the 23rd of November. These men were a complete separate entity from the police force posted at the checkpoint. This brings us to the 23rd of November 2009. At around 9 in the morning that day, a convoy of vehicles left Buluan, which is a municipality of Maguindanao. Some reports indicated that there were 7 vehicles in the convoy, others reported 8, and some even reported 9. Later, we will hear how some individuals have left the convoy shortly after their journey started. The vehicle's passengers were mostly female relatives of Esmail Mangudadatu, who at that time was a vice mayor. In the convoy was also his pregnant wife, Jenilyn. Other members of the convoy were lawyers, journalists, and other media workers who were asked to tag along to cover Mangudadatu's filing of certificate of his candidacy. Mangudadatu himself was left at home after receiving death threats in the lead-up to the day. In retrospect, this was a very unsubtle foreshadowing of things to come, really. if you think about it. There were more than 60 people in the convoy, which included at least 37 journalists. Mangudadatu was not worried when he decided to put together these specific people into the convoy. After all, the two rival clans followed conventions in their uneasy coexistence in Maguindanao. Part of those conventions was that women, children, and the elderly were supposed to be off limits as targets. As this horrible story will show you, this conventions meant nothing on that fateful day in November 2009. And so the journey of the convoy began. According to reports, it was unclear what route was taken by the convoy at the beginning of their journey, but for the last stretch of their journey, reports stated that the convoy took the Cotabato-Isulan National Highway. Other reports were more specific and stated that after leaving Buluan, the convoy proceeded to Tacorong and then on to the Cotabato-Isulan National Highway. Now, at one point in their journey, the convoy was joined on the highway by two vehicles that were not part of the convoy at all. These were civilians, and these civilians just happened to be there on the same highway with them. In his testimony, one of the convoy drivers admitted that when these two vehicles appeared on the highway with them, he allowed one of them to insert themselves into the convoy and to appear as if they were part of it. The two vehicles were both Toyotas. One was a red Toyota Vios and the other was a blue Toyota Tamaraw FX. The driver, who I mentioned before and who testified about letting one of the cars in between the convoy, did not really clarify which car he actually let into the convoy. Needless to say, they all would have looked part of the same convoy to any third-party observer then, and that would prove fatal as the day went on. Now, somewhere between 9 and 10 in the morning, some journalists who were part of the original convoy left the group to go back to their accommodations in Tacorong. They wanted to pick up some gear and reconsider their security situation. Having arrived back at their hotel in Tacorong, the journalists were immediately informed by the reception that some men had been asking about their names earlier that day. Hotel personnel confirmed that they did not disclose the journalists' names, but the journalists were rightfully scared and decided against rejoining the convoy. So those were the journalists and those were the individuals that I have mentioned before who have left the convoy before they got to the next checkpoint. As for the remaining members of the convoy and the two vehicles, they continued driving until they reached Sitio Malating, some 10 kilometers away from their destination, Sharif Aguac. At a checkpoint in Sitio Malating, they were stopped by policemen who wanted to conduct a routine check. We have already heard a few minutes ago how these policemen were essentially deployed to Malating to look out for the Mangudadatu convoy. Now, if you're wondering why the police were so okay being deployed for the Ampatuan's personal use, just remember that the Ampatuans essentially owned the police force in the area. Nevertheless, these police officers, who later turned witnesses, would testify later that during the routine check of the convoy, some 100 armed men emerged out of nowhere. Some reported they came in from a nearby banana grove. The 100 men then started accosting the convoy members. I can only imagine the mounting trepidation and fear that the convoy members were feeling at that point. After all, they were aware of the threats made to Esmail Mangudadatu, but they did not think anyone would hurt them because of the conventions I mentioned earlier. They may have expected to be roughed up and intimidated, but nothing worse than that really. Additional testimony by the police officers on site confirmed that one Ampatuan clan member was definitely present at the checkpoint with those armed men. That individual was Andal Ampatuan Jr. Unbeknownst to Andal Jr. and his armed men at the time, Jenaline Mangudadatu, Esmail's wife, managed to make a call to her husband telling him of what was happening at that very moment. Eventually, Andal Jr.'s attention did turn to Jenilyn, and witnesses would later disclose that Andal Jr. slapped the pregnant Jenilyn with the candidacy application form that she was planning to submit on her husband's behalf. This was a cruel act towards another person, let alone a pregnant woman. With Andal Jr. was another recognizable individual called Datu Unsay. He was the mayor of the town of Ampatuan. Yes, very much a town named after the clan. Reports would later reveal that 3 of the men that were in a different convoy saw how Andal Jr. approached Jenilyn's vehicle and boarded it. It is presumed that Datu Unsay was also in the same vehicle as Jenilyn and Andal Jr. Shortly after Jenilyn's vehicle was boarded, the 3 witnesses were shocked to hear several gunshots emanating from Jenilyn's vehicle. The witnesses immediately started their vehicle and fled the scene that was unfolding in Malating. Later reports would confirm that it was Datu Unsay who shot Jenilyn in the vehicle, instantly killing her and the child she was carrying. By 11 a.m., Philippine Army units were alerted of what had happened and was still happening at the convoy. They immediately conducted a search for the members of the convoy. I would like to think that maybe Jenilyn's call to her husband Esmail Mangudadatu contributed to this response by the army, but I could not verify that. After this point, things unfolded pretty quickly and brutally. Around noon, reports would later show that one of the journalists, Noel De Sena, sent a text message to his brother asking him to pray for him and the others as their situation was quote-unquote critical. Survivors further related later to journalists that the convoy vehicles were commandeered from Sitio Malating to a place in Sitio Magating in Barangay Salman, still in the town of Ampatuan. It took around 30 minutes to get there from where they were at the checkpoint. It horrifies me that this was, in a way, the convoy's short journey to their doom, really. And at that very moment, they did not even know it yet. They may have expected something bad, but not as bad as what actually confronted them there. At the site in Magating, survivors and witnesses were greeted by what can only be described as a morbid scene, the type that makes you feel a dreadful sensation in the pit of your stomach. They saw a heavy-duty backhoe that they immediately deduced was used to dig 3 mass graves that were on that hill. Very obvious mass graves. The site where they were had neither residential or commercial areas nearby, so in the end it was just the convoy and the armed men. No one could help them. It must have been harrowing for the people within the convoy to see these graves and to slowly realize and then understand what these armed men had in store for them, especially after they saw how the backhoe bore the name of then Maguindanao Governor Andal Ampatuan Sr. in big and bold letters. Without waiting any second longer, the armed men started firing mercilessly at the hostages. They shot them systematically, wanting to be sure they got everyone. They shot the women, the journalists, all of them at close range to ensure maximum damage. As soon as the armed men had killed a few, they immediately started dumping the bodies into the mass graves unceremoniously. They covered them and continued to kill the others like it was just another workday for them. From the infamous crime scene photos that had been released at the time, it looked like the armed men did not bother to bury all of their dead victims in the end. It is believed that the men stopped their cover-up after spotting a helicopter in their vicinity. They may have suspected that someone was already looking for the convoy at this point. After all, a few individuals from the convoy had escaped, and then there was that call that Jenilyn placed to her husband, Esmail. Other reports had a different version of events and reason as to why the armed men fled the scene before completing their crime. One report stated that the armed men had received a call, warning them of an approaching army unit. I think this is likely to have been the truth because army soldiers would later testify that when they finally arrived at the mass graves, the backhoe's engine was still roaring, and the engine was spewing smoke that was easily spotted by the soldiers, indicating that the armed men left in a hurry and quite recently at that. However, they did not spot any of the armed men anymore when they finally arrived at the site. They immediately saw, however, that over 20 dead bodies were sprawled around the area. Others were left on the ground or in their vehicles still. It was already around 3 in the afternoon at this point. The soldiers later described 3 mass graves. The first grave had 24 bodies in it, including the bodies of the ones who were not part of the convoy. Remember those 2 civilian vehicles? The second grave had 6 bodies and 3 crushed vehicles in it. The last grave had 5 bodies in it. All in all, the soldiers and subsequent investigators found 35 bodies in the graves and 22 on the ground, a total of 57 fatalities. At the time, there were still 3 to 4 unidentified bodies and at least 4 missing. Of the 57 dead individuals, around 30 were journalists, making this ambush one of the deadliest single events for the press in memory. In the years during the trial, a 58th victim, Reynaldo Momay, was included in the official number of fatalities, but the body of this person was never actually found. Now, what makes this horrible crime even more horrifying is the fact that later investigations showed that at least 5 of the 21 female victims were tested positive for semen, but it was not clear whether this was a result of rape or something else. The post-mortem made a point to investigate possible sexual assault as some of the women were seen to have their trousers unzipped. It was first thought that this was simply a result of the violence that went on, or maybe a result of the body bloating after death. In the end, only one of the female victims was declared positive for sexual abuse. Nevertheless, post-mortem examination also showed that some of the victims, both male and female, were shot in the genital area. Some were mutilated. Many were mutilated in the face, which made them essentially unrecognizable. There was an immense hate that went with the killing of the Mangudadatu convoy. By the 24th of November, President Makapagal Arroyo declared a state of emergency in Maguindanao, Sultan Kudarat, and Cotabato City. Politicians nationwide called on the police force to quickly identify the perpetrators of the massacre. In the meantime, the Justice Department had made sure that special prosecutors were called in to prepare the prosecution of any individual who would eventually be charged. By the 25th of November, the political party to which the Ampatuan clan belonged unanimously voted to expel 3 Ampatuan family members, Zaldi, Andal Jr., and Andal Sr. Ampatuan. The next day, Andal Jr. surrendered to his brother Zaldi, and he was quickly transported to Quezon City, a city just northeast of the nation's capital. There, he was surrendered to the National Bureau of Investigation, or NBI. By the 28th of November, the government had filed multiple murder charges against Andal Ampatuan Jr. He was quick in planting the seeds of reasonable doubt when he was charged by pointing his fingers at the MILF, or the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, a political organization that strongly advocates for the autonomous region for the Moros in Mindanao. Days later, on December 3rd, military and police personnel acted upon a tip and raided a vacant lot near the Ampatuan mansion in Sharif Aguac. They discovered an array of explosives, weapons, and ammo boxes that were stamped Department of Defense Arsenal, showing yet again that the Ampatuans did not just get the political and firepower out of nowhere. The national government in Malacanang was most definitely complicit in one way or another. The next day, the mansion itself was raided, and in it, both military and police personnel found a hidden armory behind a concrete wall with ammo cases of M16s, M14s, and possible M203s, all bearing the stamp, again, of the Defense Department. At the same time, a parallel raid at Andal Sr.'s home did not yield any results. By December 5th, President Arroyo placed the whole of Maguindanao under martial law. Ampatuan's private army was quickly disbanded and disarmed. Troops have seized more than 1,100 assault rifles, mortars, machine guns, bazookas, armored vehicles, and more than 500,000 rounds of bullets from the Ampatuan clan in the government crackdown on the family's private army. 4 days later, on the 9th of December 2009, the case against the Ampatuans was transferred to Quezon City. On December 15th, the case was said to be presided over by Judge Luisito Cortez, but he eventually refused to do so for fear of his family's safety. The case was eventually presided over by Judge Jocelyn Solis Reyes of Branch 221 of the Quezon City Regional Trial Court. Proceedings finally started on January 5th, 2010. Andal Jr. was arraigned, and he pleaded not guilty to 48 counts of murder. An additional 15 counts of murder were filed on February the 3rd. By the 9th of February 2010, a Manila panel files 56 amended murder informations against Ampatuan Jr. and 196 other accused individuals, including Ampatuan Sr. In the end, the trial would have 197 accused, amongst which were police officers, militiamen, and members of the Ampatuan clan. Unsurprisingly, the trial of the Ampatuans and others would last almost 10 years, and a lot of things happened between the trial start until the verdict. Here are some worth of mention. In March 2010, 196 arrests were made. These were of individuals who were actively involved in the massacre or who conspired to make sure the massacre took place. As I said, this would include policemen, militiamen, and the Ampatuans themselves. By June 14, 2010, first reports of a witness for the prosecution being killed by gunmen in Maguindanao surfaced, and it was clear that even with the main Ampatuan men in prison, their power in Maguindanao never waned. By June 2011, Andal Sr. was finally arraigned, and he pleaded not guilty. There was no surprise there. By March 2012, the media reported that another prosecution witness had been killed. He, however, managed to testify prior to his death. He claimed that he drove at least 36 men in 2 trips to the massacre site. These men were the ones who operated the backhoe and also militiamen who were already on site even before the convoy arrived. By December 2012, Zaldi Ampatuan was finally arraigned and also pleaded not guilty to the murder charges. 2 years later, in March 2014, the prosecution finally rested its case against 28 suspects. In the meantime, the defense had managed to change legal teams twice between 2010 and 2014. By October 2014, the trial court in Quezon City surprisingly granted the petition for bail for 16 police officers who were also accused in the murders. The bail was set at around 12 million pesos for all of them combined. The issue of bail would become a prominent and contentious one over the years in this trial. Now, just to go back to the policemen who were accused of murder, what many reports failed to include in their timeline of the massacre was that days before the massacre, Policemen and high-ranking police officers, especially the acting chief of the Maguindanao Police at the time, Chief Inspector Sukarno Dikay, were seen to be congregating at the Ampatuan mansion, seemingly discussing Mangudadatu's plans to file for candidacy. They were openly serving the interests of the Ampatuans, and this had contributed to the organized killing of the convoy passengers. As for the aforementioned meeting, it was after this meeting on the 21st of November that many additional checkpoints were put in place, presumably to better monitor the movement of the Mangudadatu convoy. It was also at this meeting that it was finally decided that the convoy passengers will need to die. From my research, it seemed to me that there was no plan at all to let anyone survive. There was no option to keep anybody prisoner or hostage for a few days. The end goal, and the only goal, was to kill everybody who was in that convoy. According to online news outlet Rappler, the plan to kill Mangudadatu or anyone who will make his candidacy a possibility was a long time coming. Rappler reports that in September 2009, a whole 1.5 or 2 months before the massacre, Dikay appointed SPO2 Kikson Kasan as police chief of Buluan town, where Esmail Mangudadatu lived. This was potentially a way to intimidate the Mangudadatus, especially Esmail. Fast forward to November, Kasan was then requested by the Mangudadatus to provide police escorts for their convoy on the 23rd of November 2009, but it was later decided that the convoy will be left unarmed. The police very much enabled the Ampatuans in their plans to annihilate the lives of the convoy passengers. The Mangudadatus could not get any help from the army either, as they refused to be involved in such so-called political matters, meaning the security of those filing for candidacy. So, the police was never not involved in this. As I said in the beginning, the Ampatuan and the police were very much in cahoots with each other. Now, let's go back to the trial. Before the year ended in November 2014, another prosecution witness was killed and another one wounded in Maguindanao. Both were identified as former employees of Andal Jr. By the new year, in January 2015, the trial judge in the case surprisingly granted the bail petition of Sajid Islam Ampatuan, son of Andal Jr. and one of the masterminds of the massacre. In the same breath, the judge denied the petition of bail of 2 other Ampatuans, this time that of Anwar Ampatuan, who is also a son of Andal Jr., and his son-in-law Ahmad Ampatuan. The trial judge was of the opinion that, with regards to Sajid Islam Ampatuan, the prosecution could not really establish strong evidence that warranted Sajid's continued detention during the trial. His bail was set to around 12 million pesos as well. This was easily paid off by the Ampatuans, and Sajid was granted temporary freedom by March of 2015. A month later, Andal Ampatuan Sr. also submitted a petition for bail, but the trial judge denied this. The trial judge stated that the court found that the evidence of guilt against him is very strong, and there was also evidence that he monitored the execution of the convoy passengers through numerous phone and radio calls and supposedly also tried to orchestrate the escape of the men involved. But I guess this denial of bail did not really matter by July 2015 because Andal Sr. at this point had passed away whilst being confined at the National Kidney and Transplant Institute in Quezon City. He was admitted for 2 months there after complaining about abdominal pains. So, this leaves us with Zaldi and Andal Jr. in detention still. By September 2015, Zaldi Ampatuan also tried his luck in submitting a petition for bail, but he too was denied. Before the year 2015 ended, NAPOLCOM, which is the National Police Commission, suspended 11 and expelled 20 policemen. The 20 policemen who were expelled were found to have conspired with Andal Ampatuan Jr. and his armed men in killing the convoy passengers. I am personally surprised there weren't more who were expelled, but I digress. The case rolled into 2016, and for half a year or so, nothing big or hugely significant happened in the case. The trial continued to trudge along, but by June 2016, the defense was finally able to start its presentation, a good 6 years after the trial started. The defense would continue its work well into January of 2017. By May 2017, Andal Jr. too tried his luck in submitting a petition for bail, but this was denied. Now, what may not always be visible whenever a bail petition is denied or granted is when parties try to appeal the trial judge's decision at the Court of Appeals. For example, Zaldi Ampatuan's bail was denied, as I already mentioned, and whilst the trial was continuing, his lawyers appealed the denial of bail with the Court of Appeals. In Zaldi's case, the Court of Appeals denied the bail petition and upheld the trial judge's initial decision to deny bail as well. Mind you, during the almost 10 years that this trial ran, the Philippines had changed presidential administrations twice already. By 2018, the Duterte administration ordered the prosecution panel in the trial to ensure that partial ruling for some of the defendants should be made by the end of 2018. Now, oddly enough, in August of 2018, Zaldi Ampatuan was allowed to temporarily leave jail to attend his daughter's wedding. The Bureau of Jail Management explained to the media that Zaldi was able to obtain an order from the court that allowed him to leave detention from 4 p.m. to 7 p.m. on the day of his daughter's wedding. Congressman Esmail Mangudadatu of the Maguindanao 2nd District expressed how the family was in deep pain over the court's decision to grant Ampatuan this, temporary freedom. He said, and I quote, "The Ampatuans have taken so much from the families of the 58 victims. We will not let them keep taking from us every time they are out from prison." End of quote. Now, in my research, I got the impression that the judge who granted temporary bail for Zaldi Ampatuan was not the same judge who presided over the main trial. That could be an explanation as to why this bail was granted in the first place. However, I could not verify this or find any sources that could tell me definitively that this was the case. Now, we're still very much in 2018 at this point. A prosecution witness in September surprisingly recanted his testimony, saying that he was pressured to testify. It is unclear whether this was true or whether the witness felt threatened by the Ampatuans and therefore had to find a way to retract his testimony against the prime suspects for fear of his life. Now, this all leads us to 2019 and another surprising, if not incomprehensible, piece of information. Remember Sajid Islam Ampatuan, the one who was allowed bail and could go free for the duration of the trial? Well, he managed to get himself elected as a mayor in Sharif Saidona Mustafa in Maguindanao, showing that even when one is on trial for multiple murders, one could still run a successful campaign for a mayoral post. It is absurd, unconscionable, and downright unethical, but somehow allowed. Finally, on July 17, 2019, the trial ended. But it would take another 3 months before Judge Solis Reyes was ready to render her decision. So, she firstly dismissed the cases against the suspects who died during the trial proper, one of which was, of course, Andal Sr. That was it for the first part of her decision. The court needed more time for the rest of its decision. The court therefore requested the Supreme Court to grant it another 30 days before the next set of decisions. This was indeed granted later in the year 2019. In the meantime, Zaldi Ampatuan was hospitalized due to an alleged heart ailment in October 2019. Finally, just before Christmas on December 19th, 2019, the Regional Trial Court in Quezon City found 28 people, including Andal Jr. and Zaldi Ampatuan, guilty of murder, sentencing them to life in prison or a maximum of 40 years without the possibility of parole. A total of 56 people, including the elected mayor Sajid Islam, were, however, acquitted. One may have to reread that because it seems unfathomable that after a 10-year trial of around 197 accused individuals, only 28 were convicted and sentenced. As much as I would like to say that that was the end of the horror that was the Maguindanao Massacre, I can't. There is currently a second batch of complaints pending before the Justice Department. The trial court in Quezon City has also reissued warrants on 80 more people who have been on the run since 2009. If you thought that with the main Ampatuan men in jail, their influence and reach may have faded over the years, well, think again. Just recently, in June 2020, a vital witness for the second batch of complaints has fallen victim to an ambush in South Cotabato. The witness, called Sangki, survived, but his life remains in danger. The fight for justice by the family and friends of the massacre victims continues. The Ampatuan verdict in 2019 was considered, well, an imperfect justice. Some may think that this was enough to feel vindicated, avenged perhaps, but I can understand if the families of the victims may not quite feel that way. They deserve more. The families have sat through the trial for a decade and got a rather mediocre result. However, I do hope that in time the families will find peace. However, we do have to remind ourselves that some families will have dealt with their loss better than others. Take, for example, this one grandmother who was interviewed for a video that I have come across in my research. Her daughter was killed in the convoy, and the daughter worked in the media. She left behind 3 children who now must be cared for by an aging grandmother with little to no means to provide food and other necessities. The crimes of the Ampatuans did not just stop with the killing of the convoy passengers. The families left behind, the generations of children left behind, will strongly feel the effect of how this political greed had gone so wrong. My only hope is that with the second batch of complaints and the second set of proceedings, the families will finally get the justice they deserve and the closure that they really need. And with that, I want to end this rather sad episode. Thank you again for listening, and thank you for your continued support. If you want to continue supporting Lagim, please consider becoming a patron on patreon.com. As of now, I only have one tier, which will allow you early access to episodes and bonus content such as Q&A episodes as soon as you subscribe. So make sure to look for Lagim Podcast on patreon.com. You can also leave a 5-star rating and comment for Lagim on Apple Podcasts. That will really help Lagim reach more true crime fans. Now, on to my podcast recommendation of the week. My podcast recommendation of the week is a non-true crime podcast hosted by the lovely Jean, Rose, Nicole, and Daniel, and it is called Bruja Baddies. Here is their trailer.
Welcome to Bruja Baddies!
This is Daniel.
This is Nicole.
This is Rose!
And this is Jean, and this is a Panay podcast to magically disappoint our parents.
Bruja Baddies is a Filipino, Filipina, Filipinx podcast meant to create a space of healing and discussion. It is our mission that through conversation narratives that we may develop solutions for the Filipino, Filipina, Filipinx community. Our co-hosts all reside in Las Vegas, and we upload episodes every other Sunday. Prepare to laugh, cry, and ponder about the topics we discuss that are often taboo, but we explore it candidly together.
Thank you for tuning in and listening to this episode again, and come back in 2 weeks for a new episode here at Lagim Podcast. Maraming salamat at mabuhay!